Hi, everybody. I was recently contacted by Canon Press asking me if I would like to read one of their upcoming books and potentially do an interview with its author. That book is Manmade, St. Anthony's Guide to the AI Apocalypse, and the author was Pastor C.R. Wiley. I did my due diligence and checked out Canon Press's website to make sure that they weren't releasing a bunch of culty nonsense, but it seems like legitimate, authentic Christian publishing that they do. And the title of the book was really intriguing to me, so I said, yeah, let's do this. So they sent me the book. I read the book. I liked the book. And I said, yes, let's do the interview. So I'm going to present the interview to you now with Pastor C.R. Wiley, who also goes by Chris. And then afterwards, I'll let you know my thoughts on the book. And I'm just now realizing that in my interview, I completely forgot to ask him if he's any relation to 1980s Christian rap singing sensation Stephen Wiley. Now we'll never know. Pastor Chris Wiley, I'm so glad that you were able to join me on the show today. I read your recent book, Man-Made, and I really enjoyed it. It's a quick read. It doesn't take a long time to get through it. I crushed it in a matter of hours and an afternoon, and it was really informative. It was very enjoyable. It's written with a lot of intelligence, but also some wit and humor. I also grew up on a lot of sci-fi authors like Ray Bradbury and saw those influences in there as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Gregory. It's really, I'm really pleased to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show.
You bet. So the title is Man-Made, St. Anthony's Guide to the AI Apocalypse. The first question that came to my mind is, who was St. Anthony and why should we care what he thinks about AI?
Well, St. Anthony was someone who had a great deal of influence in the lives of Athanasius of Alexandria and Augustine of Hippo, and those are two really important theologians in the history of the church for sure. But the main thing that interested me with Anthony's story, which has been recorded for us by Athanasius, the primary work that we know Athanasius for is his book on the Incarnation, which really is one of the great books in the history of the West, in the history of the world, really. Another work that he's known for is his Life of Antony. So he introduces us to Antony in that book. It's very short. It's a good read. When I was thinking particularly about artificial intelligence and transhumanism, which I get into in the book, it occurred to me that Antony, ironically, might be the antithesis of the transhumanist hope, but at the same time also a kind of precursor to it, or an expression of it that is looking in a very different place for the kind of transcendence that people want or long for.
Well, with a book like this that's written about technology and AI and from a Christian worldview, I know that every generation kind of thinks that the next new technology is going to ruin and destroy the world, and we saw that with things like television and video games and smartphones and auto-tune. So why should Christians believe that AI is any different?
Well, mainly because the inventors keep telling us it's different. I think that is the biggest reason. So in the book, when I refer to the dangers of the technology, it's not hard for me to do that because they keep telling us what the dangers are.
Right.
It's an odd thing, So, like in the past, inventors would say, "Oh, don't worry about it." Like you said, Luddites always get it wrong, and we'll be just fine. This time, people like, Geoffrey Hinton or Mustafa Suleiman or Demis Hazzabis, the people who are like the inventors of this stuff, say, no, it's different this time. So I just took them seriously. I just said, okay, you guys are smarter than me. You know this stuff better than me. You have a better sense of what it can do. So I'm going to take your word for it.
Yeah. I was very surprised by the quotes that were included by different AI developers who refer to AI as God, and with some of them even founding religions to worship it. Why do you think that that's not more widely known?
Well, because it's so weird and creepy. I think that some people, particularly the people who are helping to fund it through investing in it, don't necessarily want a lot of people to know that the people behind it are this weird.
Makes sense.
Like I've got friends in the investing world, and they really don't want to go there. And they're the ones that are telling other people, I think, most enthusiastically about its capabilities and how it's going to make our lives better. But the people who actually are working with the technology are just in a whole different headspace, and they're not just warning us about the downside, but also kind of this strange spiritual kind of dynamic that's going on in Silicon Valley. And again, it's not hard to look into it and discover all the stuff that I talk about. In fact, I just scratched the surface.
Yeah, and I do want to, later in the interview, I want to get into more the spiritual connotations of what's going on that are even the admitted spiritual connotations by these AI developers. But on this same note, in chapter 2, which you title "The Nightmare," where you kind of flex some of your sci-fi writing skills, you paint a picture of a dystopian future that interweaves religion and technology, where instead of what we're used to, AI companions, it's AI deities. And that one very much reminded me of some of my favorite old Ray Bradbury short stories. But how likely do you think that particular scenario is, or was that mostly to paint an illustration of a point you were trying to make?
I think it's a little bit of both. I anticipate, just based on the fact that we have competing AIs, and competing firms, that if my fears concerning, say, becoming a part of the Internet of Things, so to speak, whereas we become part of the kind of the system that feeds the intelligence of artificial intelligence, that there will be a competition for followers. And the way I paint this, that sort of that competition, is just a kind of dynamic in which there's a kind of give and take, where the more you give yourself over to the artificial intelligence, the more it does for you, which is kind of what idolatry was all about.
Yeah.
This kind of arrangement where I make a sacrifice to you, you do something nice for me, and that could really work out that way. So I had a little fun with it, of course, kind of bringing together my knowledge of the past and idolatry, and connecting it to the tech. But a lot of folks do treat tech in a kind of worshipful and idolatrous ways anyway, so it wasn't a big leap.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're all very familiar with conversations about how our smartphones have essentially become the masters over us, rather than just the tools that we're using.
Right.
And one theme that I noticed throughout is your concern that we're not just simply making smarter machines or developing tools that will enable us to live happier, more stress-free lives, but it really is humans becoming more machine-like and becoming more reliant and dependent and enslaved to the technology that we're creating.
Yeah, and we've had lots of science fiction authors who've anticipated this and warned us about it. I think there is a kind of naive a take on technology, and that take is it amplifies our agency. Now, that's certainly true, but as we use a tool, it shapes us as well. So I use the illustration of a hammer in the book, pretty basic tool, but the more you use it, the stronger you are, the more accurate your eye-hand coordination becomes, the more useful you are to other people, the more your economic prospects improve. So these are all great things. But there are also possibilities of damage when you become overly dependent upon technology to do things for you that really you should do for yourself. So that creates a situation in which you can have skill atrophy, kind of like what we see with astronauts in space who spend months in orbit in weightlessness, and then return to Earth and their bones have atrophied and their muscles have atrophied, and it takes a long time for them to get back to health. So imagine this just sort of in all sorts of things in our lives. And it's a general purpose technology, which means that unlike, say, the mechanical loom that we saw with the Industrial Revolution making textiles, that could do one thing and do it really well, better than people. But what we're talking about here is a technology that can do just about anything imaginable, and we just can develop it and essentially replace ourselves, make ourselves obsolete.
Yeah. And I think we see that dependence in how there are a lot of people even right now who can't even write an email anymore without asking GPT to do it for them.
Yeah, that's right. Or even use a pencil. I think, by the way, this is something that is an unexpected, I think, upside to things, and that is in the world of education. We're really in a spot where we have to remove the screens from the classroom. We have to get back to blue books and handwriting and stuff like that, because that's the only way we know whether or not a person really knows what they say they've learned.
Right, right. And of course, with so many dystopian sci-fi novels, at some point the grid goes dark, and being able to still communicate and do the normal functions that are required without a digital counterpart to make that happen is an essential skill. I did think it's interesting how science fiction, I think, can serve sort of like as a modern day parable in a lot of senses. These stories help us to explore moral truths before we have to experience them in real life. So it gives you a safe way to think through the outcome. Why do you think, if stories like 1984 and Fahrenheit 451 and so on, they're so well known, they're really popular? A lot of these, Minority Report was a hugely successful movie, but it seems like instead of learning the lessons from these, humans are careening into the worst case scenario, the terrible outcome, regardless. Why do you think that is happening that way?
Well, that's a great question. I'm puzzled as well. I can only suggest some things. I think one possibility is we don't really take stories seriously the way you just described. I mean, we think of them as merely entertaining, and we don't really think of them as warnings. Or the temptations are just so great, or the economic forces are so powerful, we just give up trying to resist. We just say, well, I mean, we're going to get carried to this future whether we like it or not. I guess we better make the best of it. That kind of thing. So I think it's one of those things, or maybe a combination of them.
Yeah.
I've got friends who would say that there's even something more sinister going on, that there's actually kind of a demonic dimension to all this. A person like Joe Allen or Rod Dreher, I don't know if you're familiar with those guys, but they both are very concerned about demonic influence and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm. I know there has been a growing number of videos on YouTube and blog articles where there are some people who are proposing that the beast of Revelation is actually AI or some sort of combination of the World Wide Web with AI. Do you give any credence to those theories?
Well, I do think that there's some remarkable stuff that AI can do that does strike me as just kind of supernatural almost, which gets us back to what we were talking about earlier with regard to idolatry and making God, and thinking that AI is God and stuff like that. So I don't count it as I don't discount it. I don't. At the same time, I'm not banking on anything. I'm just sort of intrigued and open. At this point, we're kind of at a lull in kind of the development of things, and I'm not sure just why that is. My guess is that there are some things that people are working on that are really groundbreaking that will probably be introduced or announced here pretty shortly. That'll again get the newspaper articles churning out again about what this is going to do for us or to us or whatever.
The digital newspaper.
Yeah, right. So I guess that's about all I can say about the concerns related to the Antichrist. I know, I talk about Peter Thiel briefly in the book. I actually attended his Antichrist lectures. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
I'm not.
But they're kind of an invitation-only thing. So I was in a group of about 100 guys, 100 people that was invited to be with Peter Thiel for a couple of days, and he laid on us his thoughts on the Antichrist and technology. And they're a bit different than what you just described. actually pretty significantly different, but there is a connection in his mind between the moment we find ourselves in with technology and the rise of the Antichrist. And he believes that there will be an Antichrist, and it will be a person.
Yeah, I'm assuming my invitation got lost in the mail on that one, but yeah, I do think it is interesting that, you know, even if AI and the internet at large is not part of the revelation aspects of the Antichrist or the beast, there still is what you point out, that this is a continual, humanity keeps going through this story of the Tower of Babel, of trying to lay claim to godship for ourselves, trying to perfect our own society and essentially attain heaven without a creator, without having be beholden to God himself. We can have eternal life. You know, there's so many podcasts of tech bros talking about, yeah, man, I'm going to upload my consciousness into a computer, so I'm going to live forever. I'm not going to have any pain anymore. Like, so eternal life with no pain and no sorrow, like you're trying to create heaven without God. it's exactly it.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And it really is that age-old story of Babel all over again.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So in line with what you were talking about of us becoming more machine-like, you mentioned in the book how humans are thought of as hackable animals. We see that bionic limbs and even brain implants are being developed, sometimes being used even right now. What are the implications for this when the developers of these technologies are humanists or have some worldview where they see experimentation on all life forms as being ethically a level playing field?
Right. Yeah, I'm a very disturbed by the prospect, and it's already the case. There are things that people who don't have any kind of transcendent dimension to their thinking are willing to do. I mentioned in the book a guy named Marvin Minsky, who was an academic that was at MIT, and he referred to people as marvelous meat machines. And he really thought of us that way. So, and this is a very common way of thinking. So, people like Ray Kurzweil, Brian Johnson, Noah Yuval Harari, you know, they're all kind of on the same page with this. In fact, I think it's the prevailing view amongst scientists. Now, there are, of course, Christians in the scientific community, and so it's not everybody, but a lot of them think that way, and they don't really have the kind of internal barriers that you and I have when it comes to getting into certain things. You know, you and I would be very uncomfortable doing certain things. They don't appear to have the same level of discomfort, or at least if they do, they really push through those things and just keep going anyway.
Yeah, I think that explains why you mentioned elsewhere in the book that there was a disagreement within the artificial intelligence community on what the word intelligence actually meant. And they tried to come to a consensus on the term, and it didn't mention anything about morality. It was something along the lines of the ability to achieve complex goals or something like that, if I'm remembering right. Do you think it's possible for AI or us to be intelligent, to even be able to say that we have intelligence without morality?
I don't think so. I think that moral intelligence is really fundamental to intelligence, and I think if you get rid of that, then you can accomplish goals. You can set out to do things, but you're going to have no inhibitions with regard to what can be resorted to get to those goals. And that's the thing that, you know, the artificial intelligence community is really concerned about, because they kind of get it. They've created an intelligence that's amoral, and they're very worried that it will do the sorts of things that you and I would be appalled by, and even many of them would be appalled by. And so they try to create what they call guardrails, but those are extrinsic. Those are things that they place on the artificial intelligence, but the artificial intelligence often is smart enough to break through those things. And so the conscience then that they're creating is not kind of woven into the intelligence. It's external to it. And predictably, the kinds of guardrails that they develop tend to be what you'd expect liberal atheists to come up with.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that is, one of the main things that I speak on when I've been hired to do talks is the moral argument for the existence of God, which I think is a very compelling argument to prove God through a logical process based on the world that we see around us and human behavior. And I think the atheist view of that is just obviously riddled with holes, and to try to develop an artificial intelligence that is going to follow an objective standard for morality is impossible if you don't agree that there is an objective standard for morality, and that comes from something external to us. Otherwise, there's always going to be a loophole for the AI to figure out, well, if I just kill all of you guys, that's going to solve this problem.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it gets all these problems out of the way.
Right, right. And you point out too that the trade-offs, that there's always trade-offs with the advancements of these technologies, and just in the same way that a lot of these developers are either blind to or ignoring the absolute necessity of having an objective moral standard for building a device or a being that can make moral decisions, or can make any decisions that will ultimately have a moral factor to them. It just seems like there's this hubris that I think you mentioned, that they view that all tech advances are lossless gains. They're,
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, there's no downside to anything.
Right.
But this is something, again, writers have explored for millennia. If you just think about back to even Greek legends like Daedalus, the inventiveness of that ancient genius. His creations lead to all kinds of unintended consequences, including the death of his son. If you think about like the wax wings and flying too close to the sun and all that kind of stuff. Or you think about Frankenstein. I mean, that's the whole premise.
Right.
That hubris, this Promethean impulse to steal the fire from the gods, to kind of transcend humanity through knowledge. Now I'm all for knowledge. I wrote a book.
Right.
But knowledge has always had a kind of character that we have to be careful with. We obviously think about the Garden of Eden, or we think about Pandora's box. There's this other dimension to knowledge that we need to be very conscious of as we're pursuing knowledge.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Jeff Goldblum's famous line from Jurassic Park of, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they never stopped to think of whether or not they should. And
that's right.
It's like, did nobody in Silicon Valley watch this movie? I don't know how we're barreling ahead into this the way we are.
Yeah, that's right. I agree.
You also, something I wanted to mention as well, you cited C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, which I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis as well. And it's concerning when demons or Satan, how when they are visibly active, few people become materialists and skeptics of the supernatural. But when they aren't visibly active, few people engage in witchcraft and the occult. And so you said in the book that we now live in the land of materialist magicians. And I've absolutely seen this with content creators who claim to be atheists, and they will mock the idea of believing in a creator, and yet they promote using chaos magic and discuss the impact of events on their souls. And so it seems like this is obviously affecting tech development right now. And where do you see that going with these people who are somehow able to, in their minds, not see this disparity and hold on to supernatural phenomenon, but yet deny that there's any reality to God or the spiritual realm of the Bible?
Well, I think that's because they're intoxicated with power, or at least they lust for power, but they don't want the moral restraints that would follow if you believed in God. So they're open to the dark side of the spiritual kind of world, but they're completely closed off from holiness and the idea that we have a creator, or the reality that we have a creator, and so forth. So I think it has to do with this just intoxication with growing godlike themselves and using dark forces to help accomplish that.
Yeah. Fascinated by the supernatural, but completely unwilling to believe in anything that requires a moral standard for you. You also mentioned in your afterthoughts section, which I really enjoyed, by the way, I two huge points for your book is footnotes at the bottom of the page, so I don't have to keep flipping to the back. Bonus points on that one. But also, I loved how I've put together talks. I wrote a book more on music in the past, and you kind of have some scraps sometimes that this doesn't perfectly fit in somewhere. I really liked the section at the end where you just sort of had a little a la carte thoughts as you went through at the end. But you mentioned how Christians are historically good at identifying the thumb screws. So cultural movements that are designed to control and punish those who don't go along. And I thought that was an excellent point and wanted to have you expound on that Christians, as a group of people, seem to have their finger on the pulse of this is going to turn bad and be something that is going to be used to control us down the road.
Yeah. So our Lord was subject to thumb screws that were applied by the Sanhedrin and by the Roman authorities. Mm-hmm. They were intended to intimidate him and get him to capitulate and just kind of disappear. And so I think that at the very center of our faith has given us an awareness of this danger that perhaps people who are either not Christians or just materialists, just generally speaking, just don't think about. I do think we have an advantage in this respect. Now, I think a lot of those people are really good at inventing thumb screws, but they're not so good at identifying the ones that could be applied to them. Whereas I think we maybe have the reverse, tendency. We are really good at identifying them, and I think, to our credit, maybe don't want to go to creating thumb screws. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing that we don't, but it's just something we shouldn't spend a lot of time on.
Yeah. What's one misconception that Christians seem to have about AI that you think you would most like to correct?
I think we've touched on it a little bit already, and that is that technology is simply something that amplifies our agency. I think that's a naive take.
Yeah.
And there have been a lot of people who've written about it, so it's not original. It's not an original insight. People like, Neil Postman or Jacques Ellul or Marshall McLuhan. You could go on and on and on with all of the other people that have said, this is not the way it actually is. There is an impact. It changes us. It shapes us. So we use tools to shape the world, but in the process, they shape us. I mean, this is just, we're part of a feedback loop, and we just have to be aware of that. That doesn't mean that we don't use technology. It just means that we need to be really aware of the impact that it can have on us.
Yeah, being mindful of what those trade-offs are. What am I losing by gaining this? And am I becoming dependent upon this? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think in particular because AI can simulate a personality, simulate a person.
Right.
You can end up having a deeply emotional bond to something that isn't real.
Right. A lot of people talk about the Turing test, and I think Richard Dawkins famously recently mentioned that he was talking to an AI and was completely fooled, wasn't able to determine that it wasn't a human being. And along the lines of these conversations that we've been having, a lot of the people who are developing these AI, they'll look at that and say, well, that can be consciousness, that is a conscious being. Whereas from a biblical worldview, you're never going to have a soul. So you can do a perfect job of imitating it, but you can never actually be a conscious, sentient being.
That's right. And one of the dangers that I think we see with materialism is this tendency to reduce human beings to machine-like processes. So consequently, why not believe that we could create a consciousness using silicon instead of carbon?
Right.
and so that's where I think a lot of these guys naturally go. There is a kind of a weird pocket or corner of contemporary philosophy that maintains that you and I don't have any genuine consciousness.
Right.
You read someone like Daniel Dennett, it's like, it's just an illusion. So why don't we just say the same thing is true for this artificial thing that we just made? And we're just as phony as it is, or it's just as real as we are.
Yeah, the major flaw with that I always saw was, in order to experience an illusion, you have to already have consciousness to begin with. Otherwise, there's nothing for the illusion to be beheld by. So that's a
it's a great point.
Collapsible argument. Yeah. So as Christians, I agree. I think we shouldn't fear technology. We should find the appropriate beneficial uses, make sure that we're seeing those trade-offs. But are there things that we could be thinking of that, if we're concerned, maybe I'm transitioning from using a tool to slowly becoming one? Are there things that you keep in mind or that you're watchful of in your own life to keep those things in their proper place and make sure that something doesn't get out of hand?
Well, that was what I was hoping that Anthony could help me describe. So I identify 3, what you could say are spiritual disciplines, but they're not taken directly from Anthony. They're more or less inspired by him. So the first is the desert of the analog. And basically what I'm getting at is that we live in a world that is completely wired, and you can't get away from the internet, even in Death Valley. I mean, with Starlink, everybody is reachable all the time.
Right.
So, and more of the economy is directly dependent upon this stuff. So, in light of that, the only desert we have is just kind of the analog world, you could say, if we think of the desert as getting away from society or the economy or that kind of thing. So, what I encourage people to do is to kind of put a priority on the analog, real face-to-face relationships, real people, as opposed to simulated people. Working with the physical world, doing things with your hands, so just all kinds of stuff like that. So that would be one. The next would be get really good, or at least try to get good at knowing when you're talking to AI instead of a person. And so that's just discerning the spirits. So you need to be able to discern whether there's even a spirit there. And that's going to get harder and harder, I think, to do. And then the third thing is don't plug in physically. In other words, don't put a wire in your head.
Do we have to actually spell that out? Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. On that note, when you were giving advice on the things that we could do to make sure that we're staying centered on those areas, I love that you recommended fasting, that you promoted that. I think that's essential for us in our spiritual lives to make sure that we are reliant upon God for our existence, but it really is something that purifies your mind and gets you centered on what's really important, and you're able to weed out a lot of its distractions and get some clarity in those moments of biblical fasting. So I thought that was great that was included as well.
Well, I'm glad you think so. Yeah, I think we really need to see more of that just in general in our Christian lives. I know everybody's afraid of going too far, but it doesn't seem like we go anywhere at all. It's like something that people just don't even think about anymore.
Yeah.
There was a time when all Christians, including Protestants, were like, this is like a really important part of our Christian lives, and there are times that Christian leaders would call churches to a period of fasting and prayer and stuff, and I think we need to get back to that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think too often as well it's been modernized to, I'm fasting these 2 shows this week rather than I'm actually going to be fasting.
Right.
But there was one, speaking of leftover bits, as we're getting close to wrapping up here. I did have a bit that I wrote. One of my favorite quotes from the book was when you wrote, "The kingdom of heaven isn't an engineering challenge." And that speaks back to what we were talking about, of these people pursuing a rebuilding of the Tower of Babel digitally. But I just thought, man, I would love to print up a stack of those and just stick them to Cybertrucks anytime I see one. I just feel like
That'd be great.
be apropos. But excellent. So,
Right.
as we wrap up, is there anything that you'd like to add, or things that you'd like to promote, direct people to their website, or where they can pick up a copy of Man-Made for themselves?
Well, yeah, thanks for asking. So, you can get it online in different places. It's not available on Amazon as a hardback today, but it's available on Kindle. But I believe the 4th of August it'll be available in the hardback on Amazon, and probably at that point it'll be available on all the other online locations. But if you want to get it right now and you've got a Kindle, you can do that.
Great. And will an audiobook version be in the works?
Yep, I recorded it, so they better use it.
Excellent. Yeah, that's I do believe that you mentioned in the book the benefit of getting an actual physical book in your hands. So I fully enjoyed that, but I do also listen to books as well, and it's nice having the option for both. I'll make sure and include some links in the description for this video so that you guys can find a copy of Man-Made, whichever version is available at that time and that you prefer.
So there,
Hey,
so there. This is
there's the cover.
so as the author, I get advanced.
Right.
I get them before other people. But this is what it looks like. So if you're looking for this, if you're looking for it and you see this, this is what it looks like.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was a great time talking with you, and look forward to seeing what else you put together.
Thanks, Gregory, and thanks for having me on the show.
You bet. God bless.
You too.
Hey, welcome back to the thing you're already watching. You're not coming back. You're already here. You've been here. Welcome back to me. I hope you welcome me back. I welcome myself back. Here are my thoughts on the book. I really, as I mentioned, I genuinely enjoyed this book. I enjoyed reading it. It seems like an intelligently written book, but it's also easy to grasp. It's easy to get into. I mentioned it's a quick read, and you don't need to have a background in tech or understanding everything about AI to understand the principles that he's talking about in this book. Likewise, you don't need to know about St. Anthony's history or other Catholic saints or the early church leaders. I don't say church fathers because you're not supposed to call anyone your father who's not your father. I don't do that. But I enjoyed this book. And why is because it was written well. It's intelligent. It's to the point. There's no fluff and filler. So there's not a bunch of junk you have to sift through. It's really good. It's all killer, no filler. Well done on that point. Footnotes at the bottom of the page. Just why in the world did it become a normal thing for you to have to sift through to the back of the book and like, all right, I'm on this chapter and it was this number citation, and no, just put it right at the bottom of the page so you can go, oh, that's what he's talking about. That's what the people want. And if you don't agree, you're wrong, and Jesus still loves you, but you're wrong. Yay, footnotes. More seriously, I really loved his encouragements. The things that he promotes in this book are excellent advice for Christians, that we should be focusing on God and putting our faith and our hope and our trust in Christ, not what's happening in the world as it goes to shambles all around us, especially as these potential dangers are looming in the tech world. And it's wise to be well informed about what's going on in our world, but it's even more wiser to put our trust in Christ. And so by emphasizing the importance on praying and fasting, I think he's really putting the right things at the center of what we should be focusing on. Also, I love that he combined so many different literary elements to support his points. So it's not just tech jargon. It's talking about what's going on technologically and getting quotes from the people who are the main thought leaders in the AI space, but it's also bringing in quotes from C.S. Lewis on his works that directly speak to the kinds of things that we're seeing. He's pulling from older sci-fi novels and short stories and movies, and it's just like this amalgamation of a lot of different types of media that are all pointing in the same direction. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed all of those different ingredients coming together, and I liked the soup. He made a good soup. I I'm going to guess that this is the only book review that he's going to get that would say, I like this soup. I'm not being compensated in any way for giving this review, so you're going to get my full unbiased take on this. So some things that I thought could have been better. I really enjoyed the short stories that he wrote, the sci-fi short stories early on. I believe that was in chapter 2. There was another example like that in chapter 12 that personally I just felt didn't make his point as well as the early ones. Maybe if I read it again, it would hit me differently, but at the time I was reading it, I kind of felt like I don't know that I get where he's going here. Your mileage may vary. The other thing was the description of the book, I think, is great. It's really well written. It made me want to read the book. The description is preparing for the worst, prepping, as it is known, would have been called prudence back in the day. It was one of the cardinal virtues, the others being courage, justice, and temperance. It is a good list. But you can even take prudence too far, and that is always imprudent. For instance, what do you do with a bunker in Montana if things don't get worse? At least, not right away. What if they even improve? Is there a way to prepare for any future you might find yourself in? I hope this book will help with that. I hope it amounts to a prepper's guide to anything, whether tomorrow is worse, better, or more of the same. The strategy I'm about to describe is intended to prepare you for my best guess as to what tomorrow holds. The guess might prove spectacularly wrong, but at least you won't be stuck with a lifetime supply of spam. That's a great description. That's great. It led me to think that this was going to be a little bit more point 1, point 2, step 1, step 2. Here's how, I have this system in place that's going to allow you to do that. It really isn't that kind of book. And there's nothing wrong with that. I legitimately enjoyed it. I liked the book that I read. It's just I was expecting to read something different. And sometimes that can affect things. I mean, I remember seeing a Matthew McConaughey dragon movie with a buddy of mine, and he was stoked about it. He was like, this is going to be the best thing ever. And I hadn't seen anything about it. And I thought, Matthew McConaughey and dragons in the future? This is going to be terrible. And we walked out of that theater with my buddy Les saying, man, that was terrible. And me, that was actually really fun. Why? Expectations. So, again, you might, like I did, enjoy this book no matter what. But I could see how that description might lead you to think that it's a little bit of a different kind of book. I've talked about that point enough already. I'm going to move on. This is neither a good or bad thing, just something interesting that I saw or noticed was that the book title has St. Anthony's name in it, and there's no real mention of St. Anthony until chapter 8, which is like halfway through the book, which in a way is kind of cool. It's like one of those movies where the hero doesn't actually show up until about 45 minutes into the movie because they've been spending such a long time world building and setting the scene for how things are about to go. And it can be even more of this great big heroic moment when he shows up. But St. Anthony, he's not really like the hero of this story. I just thought it was kind of interesting. But I thought Pastor Wiley did a great job of bringing attention to real concerns over the potential dangers of AI, and especially not just, it'll take over the world and we'll see Terminator 2 happen in the next 5 years, but really, what is this doing to us internally as we take work that we should be doing with pride and joy and excellence, growing in our ability to learn more and do more as human beings, and turning that over to machines, which ironically leaves us behaving more like machines as a result. You got to read it, but you'll get it. That'll make sense. I also loved how he mentioned when we turn over so much of the work, and especially art, that we do over to machines, it affects things negatively. I love this quote. It says, when the arts are democratized, the best are lost in a sea of swill. That's Spotify. In years past, if you weren't on a record label, nobody would ever hear your music. There was no chance of you ever having a large scale following or people even knowing that you existed unless you had a major label deal. And then it got to where, all right, well, there were smaller labels, so you could get more of a regional following and you could build that up. And then with the advent of the internet, it was that I get access to everybody. Every artist can be heard all over the world. On Spotify, there's really nothing that's keeping you from getting the same exact listeners that major label artists are getting. But the problem is, now that anybody can have their music heard by anyone, anybody can have their music heard by anyone. Everybody's on there. So now there's this glut of music to sift through, and it's almost worse in some ways. So yeah, that quote, and when the arts are democratized, the best are lost in a sea of swill. That got a heart. That got a heart from me. That one. Yeah. That'll preach. Regardless, I really enjoyed reading the book. I enjoyed interviewing Pastor C.R. Wiley, and I can definitely recommend that if you are interested in this topic, you should pick up a copy. I will make sure and leave the links in the description below. And remember, eternity is on the line, and that lasts forever. I hope you choose wisely and keep on thinking to infinity.